every report we get gets further and further away from that balance, Mr. Speaker. I don't know what it's going to take for the government to realize that the financial plan that they say they have isn't working, going from a $98 million deficit to a $240 million deficit. Cutting your way from $98 million up to $241 clearly is not working, Mr. Speaker. Looking at those declining revenues, Mr. Speaker, and saying that the answer to that is to cut further, Mr. Speaker, that is not the way to go. Oh, Mr. Speaker, I can just tell you that if the government thinks that when they eventually pass this bill, as their majority will surely do, that it's not going to do anything more than cost Nova Scotia taxpayers more, they are sadly mistaken, and I'm getting a hint, Mr. Speaker, that you may like me to...
Order, please.
Thank you.
We'll resume second reading immediately following question period. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia struck down the province's anti-cyberbullying law. This is a real issue, Mr. Speaker, for all Nova Scotians who want to see the victims of cyberbullying protected, particularly our younger Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. The government has said that they are going to consider what to do now that this law has been struck down by the courts. I would like to ask the Premier, has the Premier decided whether the government will appeal the decision of the Supreme Court or whether they will bring in new legislation to protect the people of Nova Scotia from cyberbullying?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As he knows, the Supreme Court ruled. The ruling was just last Friday. The Minister of the Department are looking at all options for the government. One of them would be an appeal. The other would be to actually bring in our own legislation. We believe there needs to be something in place to protect people, Mr. Speaker, and we'll let the Minister and the Department do the work, and then we'll respond in due time.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am sure that we all agree on all sides of this House that leaving young people in particular exposed without the protection of a valid cyberbullying law is a situation that no one would like to see left unaddressed for long, Mr. Speaker. I recognize this is a recent ruling of the Supreme Court, but I would like to ask the Premier if he can share with the House, has the government set up a timeline for this? When might we hear a decision from the government on how they plan to ensure the protection of young people from cyberbullying? When will they have a decision about what they're going to do about the cyberbullying law?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you. I want to thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. As I said, this ruling came down on Friday. The Minister has received the ruling. The Department is looking at that, looking at what are the options for government to ensure that either we appeal the current ruling or we put in place a piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, that we believe will withstand the Charter as well as ensuring that we are protecting Nova Scotia children.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, we all want to see a solution here. We all want to see either an appeal or a new bill that will withstand any constitutional challenges and ensure that the young people of Nova Scotia, and indeed all victims of cyberbullying, have a piece of legislation that protects them without challenge, Mr. Speaker. I know that although the existing law in Nova Scotia was struck down, there are many other provinces that wish they had a cyberbullying act as strong as Nova Scotia had to protect their young people, Mr. Speaker. And that only comes as a result of consultation among experts and stakeholders and parents and educators and those themselves that have been on the victim end of cyberbullying, Mr. Speaker. Does the government's plan to consider its options include consultation with all the affected parties?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I said, the minister received this ruling on Friday. Of course, as we go out, it depends. Obviously, if there's going to be an appeal, it'll be in the hands of the lawyers to appeal this specific case. But if it's a case of bringing in new legislation, of course, the minister will be reaching out. I think it's been been widely reported. Dr. Wayne McKay, who was a member part of this, talked about how quickly this piece of legislation had been put together before. So part of the process of our bringing new legislation would be reaching out to those partners of ours outside the government, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the next piece of legislation will stand.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, back in 2013, when the Premier was Leader in Opposition, he wrote to healthcare workers in our province to let them know that he would respect their hard-earned collective rights. And I'll table that letter, Mr. Speaker. 2 years later, this Liberal Premier has done anything but, Mr. Speaker. First, he took away the collective rights of home care workers with Bill 30. Then, health care workers with Bill 37 and Bill 1. And now, this government is going after the collective rights of social workers, highway workers, teachers, 75,000 Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the Premier is this. Why has the Premier once again broken his promise to respect the hard-earned collective rights of Nova Scotia?
Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure all members of this House and indeed all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, this government respects the collective bargaining rights of all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We've heard loud and clear from Nova Scotians, though, that we need to live within the fiscal plan that we have and the fiscal finances this province has, Mr. Speaker. We've made a commitment to Nova Scotians that all of us are going to share in this journey as we go forward. No one, Mr. Speaker, is losing anything that has been earned to this point. No one is being clawed back. No one has had anything taken from them, Mr. Speaker. What we have said, there's an agreement before us that we believe is fair, Mr. Speaker, to workers, fair to Nova Scotians. We look forward, Mr. Speaker, to continuing to move forward and build on this. And I want to remind all members of this House that the only people to lose any rights, Mr. Speaker, was the paramedics when the NDP were in power.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I remind the Premier that the paramedics went to arbitration without a gun to their head, Mr. Speaker. Exactly, yes. Mr. Speaker, in 2007, when a Conservative government was planning to take away the collective bargaining rights of healthcare workers, the current Premier objective stating, and I quote, "We support the collective bargaining process, which is working in the healthcare sector in this province." And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, incidentally, back in 2007, healthcare workers succeeded in keeping their collective rights, and they negotiated a 3% increase, an increase this Premier supported, and so much so, he appointed the former health minister from that government to chair his Treasury Board, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the Premier, why is the Premier so intent on breaking the same collective bargaining process he once stated as being a positive thing for our province's healthcare sector?
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank hardworking men and women across this province. We're very pleased to come to Mr. Speaker, we were able to negotiate an agreement at the table with residency documents, Mr. Speaker, that reflects 001 1.5.5. Mr. Speaker, we have a tentative agreement with Crowns across the province. We have a tentative agreement, Mr. Speaker, with the NSGEU with the same wage pattern that was negotiated at the bargaining table. We're continuing to work across all tables, Mr. Speaker, to be fair to all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. They have the opportunity to vote, Mr. Speaker. I think they're going to set a date. They're more than likely to have that vote, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is Nova Scotia has a fiscal challenge, Mr. Speaker, that we have to pay and live within.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today the Premier and his government are taking away the collective rights of doctors, the collective rights of nurses, the collective rights of healthcare workers, and those who care for sick and dying people in our province. They're taking away the collective rights of teachers who dedicate themselves to educating our kids. And they're taking away the collective rights of highway workers who this very night are out keeping our roads safe after the first snowfall, Mr. Speaker. These are the people who make our province the good place it is to live, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier is this: why has he attacked the rights and refused to bargain respectfully and in good faith at the bargaining table with 75,000 Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to remind her, Mr. Speaker, we've been at the bargaining table with a number of tables. We've come to agreements with a number of them. I want to explain to all members of this House, we went in with 00011. Mr. Speaker, at the bargaining table, we negotiated with unions to make it 001, 1.5, and 0.5. Mr. Speaker, we went there working in good faith. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, we have fiscal challenges in this province, and all Nova Scotians are going to have to be part of getting us back to fiscal health. No worker in this province is losing anything that they've earned or that they were into the bargaining table, Mr. Speaker. As a matter of fact, we believe we have a fair offer on the table, Mr. Speaker, fair to workers across this province as well, Mr. Speaker, as fair to the ability for the province to be able to pay.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. When the province's cyberbullying plan was brought in, Mr. Speaker, it included the creation of a cyberscan unit, which currently has 560 complaints that have been filed with it, Mr. Speaker. The cyberscan unit was created under the Cyberbullying Act, which was struck down by the courts last week. I'll ask the Minister of Justice, what is the present status of the cyberscan unit?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question to delve in a little bit deeper into the cyberscan unit. There were actually 820 complaints or individual cases that unit has looked at since it was first brought into play a couple of years ago. And the current status is they also spend a lot of their time in education, and they've done over, I believe it's over 700 presentations at schools to the police and so on. And they will continue to do that, and they will remain as a unit. And perhaps you have a further question, I could add more.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I do have a further question. Mr. Speaker, our anti-cyberbullying efforts do not include only the Cyberbullying Act, which was struck down, but also important changes to the Education Act, which, among other things, created a code of conduct in our schools, required a report card to parents on the progress on anti-cyberbullying measures in our schools, Mr. Speaker. We'll ask the Minister of Justice or whoever chooses to respond over there, Mr. Speaker. What is the progress on the efforts in our schools, which are now more important than ever, about creating that code of conduct and reporting on our progress in stopping cyberbullying in our schools?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, that is a good observation about the linkage to our school system. A lot of the, in fact, a lot of the complaints are centered around youth, and that is the most vulnerable group that we're looking at. And I have had an opportunity to speak with the Education Minister about a lot of the systems that were put in place at schools. They will continue to gather information and to monitor and to do all of the work that they were doing under the Cyber Safety Act, because they still need that information for policing and for, I think, reporting back to communities. So that will continue while we look at our options in terms of the legislation. Thanks.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, in the government's economic forecast update, they forecast capital grants requirements to be under budget by about $12.9 million. Mainly due, Mr. Speaker, to the design and construction delays for hospitals throughout Nova Scotia. Dr. Peter Blakey has said that when a hospital needs replacing, the longer the government waits, the more it's going to deteriorate. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister, why is the Minister delaying plans to build new hospitals, forcing patients to be treated in increasingly deteriorating buildings for years to come?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to say in the wee hours of the morning that we'll soon be opening a new facility in Guysborough. This government failed, the previous government failed to act. The previous NDP government talked a lot about Dartmouth General, did nothing for the 4.5 years they were in government. We have finished the fourth floor. The third is underway. Design work for the fifth and the tower, the surgical tower, is now in scope. We'll have that contract out in 2016. And there is more hospital work going on in just 2 years than we saw in 4.5 years with the previous government.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the reason he's going to be able to open a new hospital is because of the work the previous government did with the community, Mr. Speaker, to raise money for that. Take the credit all you want, Mr. Speaker. The minister can do that, but we know what the truth is. We have a deteriorating Centennial building right now that ironically is going through the same issue that we seen just a couple weeks ago or a month ago, Mr. Speaker. Construction was supposed to start in 2016, Mr. Speaker, delayed because of the Liberal government. Why does the government continue to delay the important work of improving our hospitals? When will the minister bring forward a plan to replace the Centennial building so that Nova Scotians can have access to the health care they need, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite knows, the former health minister, that if his government had done real planning and consulting instead of throwing $1 million and just hoping for the best, and in fact the plan was not adequate, was not comprehensive. We will reveal in January to Nova Scotians what the QE2 health sciences will actually look like.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of the Centennial building, another flood at the Victoria General Hospital forced officials to shut down the water and postpone surgeries yesterday. So back in September, if we all remember, another flood in the ophthalmology outpatient clinic postponed over 100 surgeries and forced to move 50 intensive care patients. So my question to the minister this morning, how many Nova Scotians had their surgeries postponed because of the latest flood at the VG Hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I can tell the member opposite is that it was about 10 surgeries cancelled when I had the last update, and I'll get an update early tomorrow morning on how things are progressing with the cleanup. And I know that when there were, in fact, cancellations during the last flood, we were able to move some of the work to another site, and eventually all of those cancellations and delays were caught up 100%. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Repeated floods and other problems at the VG continue to create uncertainty and longer wait times for people that rely on those services offered at that hospital. So my question to the minister is, what is the plan to accommodate the patients whose surgeries were cancelled on Monday? How much longer will they have to wait, knowing that they've probably waited a very long time already?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. During the earlier flood, when ophthalmology, the eye centre, in fact, had a huge hit on their plans for doing almost a couple of hundred procedures each and every day. They were able to move some of that work out to the Cobequid Health Centre. Perhaps that work will have to go on there once again, and hopefully I guess now it'll be Wednesday's question period. We'll be able to update all members of the House on how progress is going.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, teachers and students are concerned that the Minister of Education is considering cancelling all scheduled European travel. This decision would have a negative impact on many students who are scheduled to take March break 2016 trips. My question to the Minister, has the Minister cancelled European travel for Nova Scotia students?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. One of the things that we try to base all of our decisions on is the safety of our students. And when there is concern about international travel, when some of the trips that students have planned for are in areas of the world that are not stable and perhaps deemed to be unsafe, I think it's important and it's prudent on the part of the Department of Education and the administration at the schools to review those to make sure that none of our students are at risk when they leave this province.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, cancellation so close to March break will result in approximately $1,000 in fees for students scheduled to travel. Mr. Speaker, this will be a true hardship for many students who've spent a great amount of time raising funds at their school in community for these trips. My question to the Minister, will the Minister reassure students and teachers that their European travel plans will not be cancelled by the province or by the school boards?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I've stated, safety is a priority for all of our students. And at the present time, the decisions about which trips are planned, involving the parents and the school board to determine if, in fact, it is safe for the students to travel, those decisions are made with parents and with teachers and with school boards. And I would suggest that the loss of money on a trip is nothing compared to the loss of life if they're in danger.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, for the last 2 years, this Liberal government has frozen income assistance rates and arbitrarily clawed back benefits people had relied on for years, like bus passes and allowances for specific foods as recommended by their doctor. Mr. Speaker, there is no arguing that the cost of food, electricity and other essentials has risen in the last 2 years. How does the Minister of Community Services expect income assistance recipients to be able to afford these growing costs?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I thank the member for the question. There's no doubt in my mind that people on income assistance, the working poor of Nova Scotia, many of us are having difficulties meeting the basic necessities of life each day. That's why this government has started a comprehensive, significant benefit reform on a system that, quite frankly, doesn't meet the needs of people today. It's been tinkered with for a couple of decades, and so what is needed is long-term, sustainable change that actually can make a difference for people who are living on income assistance in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister has made it clear she intends to keep the rates frozen for the foreseeable future, despite the fact that yesterday's fiscal update showed $11 million were unspent in the income assistance budget, and I will table that. My question, Mr. Speaker, why has the Minister underspent on income assistance when it is clear Nova Scotians who rely on that support are struggling to make ends meet?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. What the member fails to address is that we're not underspent in that area. People are actually moving off of the system and finding work in Nova Scotia, and that's, as all Nova Scotians, we would want people to be sustainable and self-sufficient and to meet the goals that they've set for themselves. While we're $11 million underspent because people are actually moving off the system into the workforce, we actually are reinvesting into areas such as persons with disabilities and child welfare, both which are under tremendous financial strain at this point in time.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, the Minister had the opportunity to tour the correctional facility in Pictou County, the Northeast Nova Scotia Correctional Facility. Mr. Speaker, there appears to be different regulations or opinions when medication is administered in our correctional facilities in Nova Scotia. One inmate at the Pictou County Correctional Facility apparently should be taking Seroquel, a drug that helps with his depression and anxiety. For some reason, Mr. Speaker, he's not allowed to have that drug at this particular facility, but when placed in Cape Breton for a short time, Mr. Speaker, he was allowed to have this medication. He returned back to Pictou County, Mr. Speaker, and he was disallowed. My question to the Minister, why does there appear to be two sets of rules regarding the issuing of medicine within our correctional facilities?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and that's a question that I don't have the immediate answer for. I can say that when I toured the facility, there is a health centre within that facility, and it's staffed all the time. There's always nurses on staff. A lot of them come from the VON, I understand, but they're there every day. Caring for the needs of the people, the offenders that are in that institution. I'm not sure why the protocol would differ from Northeast Correctional to Cape Breton, but it is certainly a question I can look into.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, the Northeast Nova Scotia Correctional Centre opened in February of 2015. There is a state-of-the-art dentistry unit at the correctional facility. We have received complaints that you cannot obtain dentistry assistance. There's no dentist available at this site. My question to the Minister, we continue to hear about this state-of-the-art facility that meets all the needs of the inmates, but despite a dentistry unit available, there is no dentist. My question to the Minister, why isn't this service available for inmates that require dental assistance?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly recognize that dentistry and care of oral health is really important in anybody's health. So that, again, would be something I'd need to look into. I know that the facility is excellent. As I said, it has a wonderful medical section, health section. It has a social worker that's in there on a full-time basis. They also have a new office just for a social worker that's in there every day. It has really the best layout of any of the correctional facilities that we have, and I will ask about the dentistry side of that provision of services. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation. Mr. Speaker, I know many members are disappointed with the amount of money that's being spent on rural roads in the form of the Rural Impact Mitigation Budget, and it's 25% less than it was back in 2008, Mr. Speaker. The government has an extra $1 billion in terms of an extra 2% in HST revenue and an extra $500 million in federal transfer payments. So we're looking at 25% less in this budget, Mr. Speaker. Why aren't these roads that are getting less attention now? In fact, Mr. Speaker, we're only getting 3 years' worth of maintenance for the price of 4 over the course of the term of the government. Why aren't these roads important to the government?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. It's a little rich coming from him. He knows that they are important to us. We've had a number of conversations, myself and that member directly, Mr. Speaker. He has a good relationship with our staff on the ground in the county of Inverness and on all the roads that he's concerned with, Mr. Speaker. He's certainly not alone with respect to the challenges that we have on our infrastructure. We've got $16 million in the RIM budget, Mr. Speaker. We've added $1 million since coming in government. I know that doesn't make a huge difference across the board, Mr. Speaker, but we've got our roads under control as best we can. We've got a strong system that takes the politics out of it and uses the local staff and their expertise to get things done. We're doing our very best, Mr. Speaker, and again, when the member has specific requests, we certainly do our best to meet those. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the minister is doing the best he can with the budget that's agreed upon at the cabinet table, but it should be known that it's just not myself that's complaining about this. I hear about it every day, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure many other members are hearing about it as well. So it's certainly good reason to lobby for it here in the legislature, because I think what's happening in our area should be taken to the floor of this House. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is a 5-year capital plan that we're awaiting, and we know there's a $500,000 threshold on these capital projects. That means that there are many roads who might need reconstruction. I'm thinking of gravel roads that are never even going to get looked at. Why not change that policy so the threshold is lower, so these roads have a chance to get addressed?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, we have a significant amount of budget for both operational and capital projects under TIR and under the government in general. We do our very best when we move it from one allocation to the next, Mr. Speaker. We do so to get the best impact of those tax dollars. And when there's an issue, when there's a specific problem on a road, Mr. Speaker, obviously we will apply our engineering, we apply the science of volume and what we use in terms of businesses that are on that road and the importance to the community, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, it's one big pot of money. We really do apply the expertise of the local staff, and we do our very best. It isn't about budget. We look at priorities. We look at what we can do, and Mr. Speaker, we do our very best to do those year after year, and I'm very proud of the work our department does. We take the politics out of it. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education has told us many times in this House what a good friend she is to the teachers of this province. And yet, here we are, Mr. Speaker, here we are. On January 8th of this year, the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development commenced a review of the regulated childcare sector, and workers in the childcare sector tell me that they are eagerly awaiting the results of this review, which is expected sometime this spring. So my question for the Minister is this: specifically, when will the results of this review be made available?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And when we formed government in 2013, there were a number of areas within the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development that needed to have a thorough look to see how we can build on what is existing, and look at new programs and new initiatives, and stop doing things that, frankly, were not having a positive and intended outcome. One of the things that we did, first of all, of course, was public schools, and we have completed that. We also looked at early years, and in particular looking at the number of children, preschoolers, who were on wait lists. We've been able to eliminate the wait list, so there are no longer the 300 people on that list when we formed government. And the third review is the review of childcare. It is our intention to do a complete review, take one project, look at it, review it, have actions designed to improve it, and when we have completed that, we move on. And the childcare review has been completed, and we will be acting on and making an announcement about the outcome of that review in January.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the Minister for that response. Mr. Speaker, a number of areas were actually identified in that review, including wages and benefits for early childhood educators, as well as access to professional development opportunities. And undoubtedly, with the recent events involving teachers and labour relations, have child care workers concerned about their own future. So my question for the Minister is this: given recent events around labour relations, what message does she have for early childhood educators who await the results of their review?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And when we were doing the consultation as part of the review, we met with many of the early childhood educators, and together there were areas that we identified as priorities: safety for students, accessibility, affordability, and of course the wages of the workers there. And I think all of us in our meetings and in our consultation agreed that those were the areas that we would focus on, and we will continue to do that. And the results of that report, as I've stated earlier, including those 4 areas, will be revealed in January.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Health Authority estimates about 5% of Cape Bretoners, or more than 5,000 people, are without a doctor. Mr. Speaker, without a family doctor, people don't get important test results when they need them. No doctor means some people don't get important prescriptions refilled and that their conditions are not properly monitored. So my question to the Minister is, does the Minister have a plan to fulfill the Liberal campaign promise to provide a doctor for every Nova Scotian?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that there are a couple of areas of the province that are more problematic in attracting doctors to their particular areas. We have made some gains in a very, very short time. The tuition relief program allowed the first number of doctors to practice in about 9 different communities across the province. We know that we have more work to do in Cape Breton, but probably, Mr. Speaker, we need to be talking as much about a primary care giver and not just a physician in a number of cases.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and there's no question that people require some primary care workers. Mr. Speaker, an article in the Cape Breton Post this weekend illustrated that the uncertainty and fear people without a family doctor have to live with when they experience a health problem. And I'll table that article, Mr. Speaker. People say they feel down, they feel that they've been let down by this government and that they've broken their promise when it comes to doctors. So the simple question that's on the mind of many, many Cape Bretoners is, how long will Cape Bretoners have to wait for the recruitment plan of the new 11 doctors that needs to be had in Cape Breton? When will that be completed?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to say that there have been a few communities in Cape Breton that were looking for a physician for a long period of time, who have been able to get a doctor. We know that this year the tuition relief program will in fact allow us to add 25 doctors for a return of service to Nova Scotia, and what I can tell the member opposite is that Cape Breton will get their fair share of those 25.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. When this government was first elected, the former finance minister held an opposition briefing on the budget update and made quite a big deal over how the NDP never did that, and this government was going to do that to be open and transparent. We only had one of those briefings, Mr. Speaker, and then we used to get a couple days' notice. It was fallen all the way to this morning when we got about 2 hours' notice before the update. And my question is, what's happened with the open and transparency that we try to hide everything in a short notice period of an update?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I guess, Mr. Speaker, with the work being done, both in the legislature, Mr. Speaker, with my work that had me attend the COP21 conference in Paris, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, with the obligation to have a fiscal update before the end of the month, Mr. Speaker, I just had to move forward and get the job done. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think we heard the truth there. Too busy to be open and transparent was what I heard, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the minister is, was the minister surprised with the dramatic increase in tax revenue? Is he so far out of touch with what's happening in this province that he was actually surprised that revenue was down? That's my question for the minister.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the member opposite is a little bit, I guess, off base, perhaps, in the suggestion that the fiscal update isn't somehow anything but open and transparent, Mr. Speaker. The documentation, the details are all very public and open for review. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it didn't take very long, Mr. Speaker, for the members of his caucus to raise in this legislature with questions and comments, Mr. Speaker, stemming from the details in that update. So I'm not sure what concern he has with openness and transparency, Mr. Speaker. I think we've been very open and transparent with the state of the province's financial situation.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Acting Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture. Last week, when I asked about the ongoing lobster pilot project, the minister told us that the project has now been expanded to southwestern Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the acting minister does not want to talk about dispersants in the offshore. Perhaps he will talk about the lobster pilot project. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is this. If the project is successful in expanding, why can't we tell us in all Nova Scotians who and where this mystery group is?
The Honourable Acting Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As soon as the minister is ready to make that announcement, I'm sure he will.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I asked about the results of the pilot project, the minister throws out a couple of numbers to support his argument that the project is successful. Lobstermen want to know more than just that, Mr. Speaker. My question for the acting minister, who has lost his voice on dispersants, and this is specifically for him, when will all the results of the pilot project be released and his voice is gained? Thank you.
The Honourable Acting Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've never lost my voice in this legislature, and Mr. Speaker, another thing I didn't have to do was run 100 kilometers north of my riding to run in the last election either, Mr. Speaker, because my people know my voice and they hear it well.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquedominant Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Acting Minister of Agriculture, and I'm asking this on behalf of the agricultural critic. The Eastern equine encephalitis is a fatal virus. I got it out. It's a fatal virus that has impacted the South Shore and has now reached Annapolis County. The fatality rate of this infection is between 80 and 90%, and often the horses are euthanized as a precaution. There were 5 confirmed cases and 16 to 20 suspected cases in the South Shore this fall. Has there been discussions with farmers and stable owners concerning the spread of this disease?
The Honourable Acting Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. The Department of Agriculture is constantly in contact with our stakeholder community to deal with this and all issues. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquedominant Valley.
Does the acting minister know of any program to educate and promote the vaccine of the horses with this disease?
The Honourable Acting Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will direct staff in the department to provide the member with that information.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. While the Minister has unspent funds in income assistance, this past spring the Minister of Community Services cut $8.5 million from her budget for children, youth and family supports. During yesterday's fiscal update, we learned that the Minister has reversed that cut and put the money back in the budget. Mr. Speaker, when did the Minister realize her cut was impacting services and that the funding should be reinstated?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. Again, I'll reiterate that the $11 million that has been saved in income assistance is the result of people being attached to the workforce, reaching the goals that they've set for themselves, becoming self-sufficient, something that you want to see in a government. We are in the middle of transformation with benefit reform, with persons with disabilities, and with child welfare. And the last two are the ones that are the pressures with meeting the needs of Nova Scotians that rely on those services. And we'll continue to do that transformation so that those systems will be in place for generations to come. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It comes as no surprise to me that the Minister had to reverse her short-sighted cut. Now, given that many individuals across the province have raised significant concerns that recent amendments to the Children and Family Services Act could bring even more children into care, I hope the minister will be investing significantly more into youth, child and family supports that she budgeted for last year. Mr. Speaker, what increases to financial and human resources is the minister going to make next fiscal year?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I don't know where the member was over the last week, but in the last 2 weeks, this government has actually invested $1.2 million into child and youth services from every end of this province. We've increased Parenting Journey under Stronger Families NS from 12 sites to 27, which is unprecedented in the province of Nova Scotia, including 3 sites for Aboriginal, African Nova Scotia and Acadian communities. We've also increased the attachment training for Parenting Journey practitioners, and we now have a pilot project which does not exist anywhere in Atlantic Canada that I just announced in Sydney last week. We'll be announcing it again in Halifax in the coming weeks, and we absolutely are investing in child welfare. And I'm proud of the staff that works with the child welfare. I'm proud of the fact that we now have up-to-date legislation that will better protect children in the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Over the last number of sessions, and a couple of times I think during this session, I've asked the Minister of Health for an update on the funding of Oncotype DX, a test for women diagnosed with breast cancer. This test helps physicians determine the best course of treatment for someone with breast cancer diagnosis and can save women from a great deal of unnecessary treatment. The minister told the House that he's open to reviewing more information as it becomes available, and the minister has received a great deal of information on this test, and many provinces across the country already funded. So my question to the minister is, has the minister reached out to stakeholders and experts to gain more information on Oncotype DX?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I pleased to have the opportunity to respond to the member. We all know that any way that we can improve delivery for cancer treatment, in this case breast cancer, then government is prepared to move as quickly as possible. We don't have it obviously in our budget for this year, but it will get that kind of consideration as we now move into budget deliberations.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the minister for that answer, but it's not good enough at this point. We know full well the impact that breast cancer diagnosis has on our loved ones. For those of us who have had loved ones that have had breast cancer, we know that it can be an incredibly stressful and painful time. Anything that we can do to ensure someone does not go through chemotherapy when it's unnecessary can save a great deal of distress. And on the backside, it can actually save a little bit of money. Mr. Speaker, can the minister confirm whether or not his department will fund the Oncotype DX in the spring budget?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've also had conversations with the Provincial Health Authority. They, along with the Department of Health, have been looking at Oncotype DX as one of the tools that could be made available to assist with treatment. And during our deliberations over the next month or so, every consideration for this instrument to assist in fine-tuning treatment will be given that consideration.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I've asked many times before, the steps of the Northside General Hospital have been closed since February because of safety reasons. Recently, I saw a letter from the newly appointed Janet Knox, the CEO of the Nova Scotia Health Authority, that said she had signed a charter and made a promise to lead an organization that embodied the health and safety of not only the patients and residents, but the staff. Could the minister give me a good reason why the steps to the Northside General haven't been fixed yet if they embody a health and safety atmosphere?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the member representing the North Sydney area, Northside General Hospital, in fact, was probably on those semblance of steps this past weekend for a local community event. And I know that I can tell them that the tender for this project has gone out. It is approved. And hopefully, if the weather stays reasonable, it may be able to be done in this fall.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
So will the minister assure the people in Northside General, if the weather does stay well, that those steps will be repaired by year's end?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, you get the opportunity to travel around the sun 65 times, as I have. You get to do a little bit of work in many areas. I've done a little bit of cement work. If I get time before Christmas, I just may help out with getting the steps repaired.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Emergency room closures have increased by over 30%. Why doesn't the Liberal government support keeping emergency rooms open, especially in rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
What I can tell the member opposite is that our government will not be credited with closing ADRs in this province.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now resume second reading on Bill number 148 with the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition for the remainder of his time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to add to my brief introductory remarks on this bill from earlier this evening before question period. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, really the bill should be called the We Don't Know How to Negotiate bill, sponsored by the Minister of Finance and the Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. I do want to take up the theme for a few moments, Mr. Speaker, about this idea that the government claims it does not want to create two classes of employees. Well, in fact, Mr. Speaker, the bill does